Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1 of his Novum Organum, Francis Bacon is going to single out 4 classes of idols of the human mind, and the third is what he calls the idols of the marketplace, sometimes translated a little bit more literally into English as the idols of the forum, because it is fori, right? So the forum, the place where people would gather together. And he talks about this in terms no longer of individual human natures or general human nature, but something that's absolutely central to human existence. And so you could see it as coming out of human nature, but it's something that we, at least in his view, don't pay adequate attention to, and that is language. So he's going to talk about these idols being formed or arising out of the reciprocal intercourse and society, in Latin contractu et societate, of human beings. So it's just us human beings, not other animals, in relation to each other or with each other ad invicem. This is the sort of like in connection with each other. It's a term that implies going back and forth. And that's what we do with language, right? And that's what we do in intercourse and society. How do we do this? Well, there's other ways that we connect with and communicate other than straight out words, sermones or discourses in this case. But for the most part, we are using language, whether it's spoken language or written language. Even if we talk about gestures, those are kind of translatable into language as well. So all of this commerce and association is happening using language as a means or medium for that. And here's where we get into the problems. Words, he says, are formed at will of the generality. Ex captu vulgi imponitur, right? So words are imposed out of the will, the choice or the decisions of the crowd, of the majority of human beings. And because of that, arises a bad and unapt formation of words. We get a wonderful obstruction to the mind. Wonderful in the sense of marveling at, not wonderful in the sense of having positive value. And then, we get what if we just let the smart people decide things? What if they were to impose definitions? And he says the definitions and explanations which learned men are accustomed to guard and protect themselves in some instance, those don't afford a complete remedy, right? They can help a bit. As a matter of fact, that's part of what Bacon is trying to do here, because words, as he says, still manifestedly force the understanding. They throw everything into confusion and lead mankind into vain and innumerable controversies and fallacies. So sometimes we're misled by thinking that we know the meaning of a term. Sometimes we're actually talking past each other, or we've actually all got the meanings of the terms wrong and we're just kind of floundering around. Now, jumping forward into the section where he goes into more detail in section 59, he is going to tell us that the idols of the market are the most troublesome, molestima, of all of them. Why? Because they have entwined themselves around the understanding from the association of words and names. So because of the fact that we are linguistic creatures, that we exist, we don't just use language, but we exist, we think in language, our understandings, our intellects are inevitably going to be steered, perhaps even corrupted by how we're using the language. And he says that here's one of the big mistakes we make. People think that reason governs or regulates words, when in reality that's not the case. Words, and it's translated here as react upon the understanding or the intellect. It's actually two verbs in the Latin, retorqueat et reflectant, right? And both of these have this, intensifier r in it. Torqueant, to turn or to twist, right? And reflectant, to reflect, to turn aside, quite literally. So words have a capacity to mislead the intellect, and we're foolish if we think that we're just going to come up with some ideal language and everything will be A-okay. As a matter of fact, every single generation, there are not just young people who could perhaps be forgiven for this, but also middle-aged and old fools who think that they're finally going to give the perfect linguistic explanation that'll clear everything up. Never works, right? So Bacon says, why is this the case? Words are generally formed in a popular sense. So it's usually the majority who's using it, and they define things by broad lines which are most obvious to the vulgar mind, the crowd, the mass of people. And he says when a more acute understanding or more diligent observation wants to vary these words, are going to oppose it. So once something is out there in language, we can see this with many examples in our own time, it's difficult to get people to see that language is misleading them as they're trying to understand the matters that they're referencing or discussing. What about if we tried definitions? Well, there's a big problem with definitions. He says that, not only do the great and solemn disputes of learned men often terminate in controversies about words and names, in which case we should bring these disputes to a regular issue by definitions. When we produce definitions, what is the medium of a definition? It's language. So we're using this, kind of misleading, messed up tool on itself to try to make itself better. And we can indeed make it better, right? It is better to have definitions than not. But all of your definitions, like he says, consist of words, and these words produce others. So we must necessarily have recourse to particular instances and their regular series and arrangements. So definitions don't solve everything the way that some people seem to think that they do. A definition really only does its job when it's connected to lots of other things that have been arranged properly, and you can't count on that most of the time, right? Now, in 60, he's going to make a further distinction within this type of idol, the idols of the marketplace, and he's going to say we actually have two kinds depending on the reference, we could say, of the language. Does it refer to something real that just has been not well described? Or does it refer to something that isn't real, that doesn't have existence, but we imagine that it does because of some sort of theory, or perhaps a superstition, we could say as well. So he's going to tell us that some of these are formed by fanciful imaginations without an object, right? So what are examples of that? Fortune. This notion that there's, and we could even associate with a typical metaphor, a visual metaphor of a big wheel that turns, and sometimes you're on the bottom and sometimes you're on the top. Well, lots of people write about this. That doesn't mean it exists, right? Or he says the prima mobile, right? The structure of the universe. We imagine that, but maybe that's not actually the way that we think it is. The planetary orbits, the element of fire as an element, right? And like fictions, he says these owe their birth to futile and false theories. Now, there's a little bit of good news. These are more easily rooted out by either refutation of the theory or what we're translating here is desuetude, meaning the theory goes out of fashion. So, think, do people actually talk today about the ether that, radio waves are going through? No, but if you go back about 120 years, you will find people actually talking about that. And that was an imaginary thing. It didn't actually exist. But people, scientists, thought about it, talked about it, made its way into literature. It was part of the culture. As we lose that theory, as it's refuted or it goes out of fashion, we don't talk about it anymore. Great example of this, I would say, as well in psychotherapy. How many of you actually talk about an Oedipus complex these days, where it's the thing that Freud discussed at great length, like Oedipus, desire your mother, kill your father, or try to kill your father, or something like that. And we don't talk about that anymore. Why? Because Freudian psychoanalysis has basically gone out of favor. Some people like to say it's refuted, and probably the Oedipus complex is, but it's better to say that fashions have changed, right? Probably 100 years from now, the people who are on top at this point in time, at least in the States, with the cognitive approaches, quite a few of their theoretical terms will go out of fashion as well. Then we have the names of actual objects, real things, but they're confused or they're badly defined, mala terminata in Latin, or they have been hastily and irregularly, temere et inequaliter, abstracted, drawn out from the things of nature. And because of that, we're likely to go wrong in using the terms for those, right? He calls this vicious and unskillful abstraction. They're intricate and deeply rooted. And then he gives an example that he explores at length, a word that we translate in English as moist. It's kind of funny because in recent years, all sorts of people, when we, as kids used that term moist, we had no problem with it. But a lot of people get kind of, ooh, I don't like that sound, these days. That probably would be an example of idols of the marketplace. Everybody else says, ooh, moist is a gross word. So therefore you start thinking that it is, right? In Latin, it's humidus, and it plays an important role in natural philosophy, right? He says that we use this term, but it's nothing but a confused sign of different actions admitted of no settled and defined uniformity. It means that which easily diffuses itself over another body, that which is interminable and cannot be brought to a consistency, that which yields easily in every direction, that which is easily divided and dispersed, that which is easily united and collected, that which easily flows and is put in motion, that which easily adheres to and wets another body, that which is easily reduced to a liquid state, though previously solid. That's a lot of explanations or definitions of the moist, isn't it? And it doesn't hold in every single circumstance. So he says, okay, so when you're using it, somebody might call a flame moist, or they might say that air is not moist, or a fine powder is moist, or glass is moist. And then he says, it's quite clear that this notion was hastily abstracted from water only and common ordinary liquors without any due verification of it. So he's giving you a great example here that he develops at length. And he closes this section by noting that there is a more and a less involved in these cognitive distortions. So there's degrees, gradus, of what he's going to call distortion and mistake in words. And he's going to give us a few guidelines here. He says one of the least faulty classes is that of the names of substances, not imaginary substances, but real substances, particularly of the less abstract and more defined species. For example, chalk and mud are good. Earth, not so good. Right? So it's a greater degree of distortion. Why is earth more problematic? Because it's kind of more loosey-goosey, right? Words signifying actions are more faulty. For example, generate, corrupt, change. But the most problematic, he says, are those denoting qualities, except for the immediate objects of sense like heavy, light, rare, and dense. And then he says, yeah, there's also variations within these. There's some notions better than others in proportion as a greater or less number of things come before the senses, which is not to say that the senses decide everything, but, we do want to be able to say, what do these names, these words actually refer to? So this is, what he's calling the most problematic or troublesome of the idols. And it's one we can't get away from because we're not going to stop using language. And, the efforts of the 20th century to come up with a logically perfect language all foundered. So we need to be attentive to this kind of idol, the idols of the marketplace.